Good morning and welcome to Birding Basics. So today we are going to be talking about taxonomy, what it is, why you should care about it. It sounds a little bit overwhelming and pretty dry, but I do assure you that it does actually get pretty interesting, if mostly because there is drama wrapped up in any sort of science which allows for a spirit of debate, which taxonomy certainly does. So if you are starting out your birding journey, you've probably already noticed birders like labels, we like lists, we like sorting things out, whether it's by habitat, behavior, what the birds are doing, what they're looking like. We like to organize things. Life is messy and humans really enjoy the Sisyphean task of trying to put some order to that chaos. So taxonomy is our way of doing that to living organisms, whether they like it or not. So if you've wondered why your field guide for birds of North America starts with the ducks of all things, or why the owls and the hawks aren't right next to each other in it despite their similarities, taxonomy is going to be your answer to why. So, taxonomy. What is it? Taxonomy is the classification of living organisms into groups. Originally, this was done solely on the basis of shared physiological traits. But now, with the scientific advancements that are available to us, this is done through genetic sequencing. We're taking a look at the actual DNA of these organisms rather than just what they look like, what they're doing. Taxonomy was created by a real superstar of Sweden, not ABBA, but in fact Carl Linnaeus. Now Linnaeus was a zoologist, a botanist, a physician back in the 1700s when, you know, the amount of information we had on these topics were sufficiently small that one person could be considered an expert on them. I wouldn't go to this guy for medical advice today, but back in his time, really forward-thinking scientific mind. Now, he made taxonomy a thing. Ever since then, we've really gone gangbusters on sorting things out, figuring out who's related to who, and how closely related they are to each other. And he's also responsible for something called binomial nomenclature, which if you take a look at your field guide and you open it up, right next to that large print common name that's easily pronounced and kind of descriptive to the bird, you'll find a two-word name in italics, and that's the scientific name. It's Latin for a given value of Latin. It's Latin that got mugged in an alleyway, in particular because now with discovering species that are new, those naming practices of using sort of Latin has kind of fallen by the wayside. It's a dead language, and scientists have senses of humor too. So we've got Linnaeus to thank for taxonomy for all this sorting that we get to do. Which is great. We like that. So, with taxonomy, we are placing species closely together if they share similarities, right? The more closely related they are to each other, the more similarities they're going to have, the closer they are on the tree of life. What's important to remember is the tree of life is based on extant species. So these are species that are still alive. You're not going to be placing the dinosaurs on the tips of the tree of life, if you will, but they're going to be further down along on the branches, if you're going to be pushing the metaphor to that extent. Now, I do want to show you the current tree of life, and it's this. So if you look at this and it's overwhelming, that's fair. It is, you know, all of the living organisms in the world, so that's, being overwhelmed is a fair reaction, and of course if you tried to make this into something that looks like a tree, you'd get a really weird looking shrub made by somebody with a chainsaw and a hangover. It doesn't translate well. Luckily for birds, we're not looking at the entire the entire population of all of the organisms in the world. We're just looking at a single class, class Aves. And it's a little bit more straightforward. Doesn't that look way more palatable? That's an understandable tree. We like this one. But taxonomy has to do with the sorting of it. So the more similar a species is to the common ancestor of that entire class or that entire kingdom, the farther down the tree its branch is going to attach, the closer to the base. So the reason your field guide starts with ducks when you are opening up a field guide for birds of North America is because we don't have ostriches here, but ducks are the most basal bird that we have in North America, at least. And before somebody argues with me that, well, you can definitely find ostriches in North America, there's a farm right off of 5, you can find them in zoos. That's not how the American Ornithological Union comes up with lists of species. You can't mark a bird off its life list if you found it in a zoo. But that's something totally separate. Now, field guides do this to the best of their ability, following the taxonomic updates. And I say to the best of their ability because taxonomy is always changing. DNA is not an exact roadmap. There's lots of debate that happens, different interpretations of genetic markers, and we're still discovering new species, and species are still having their genomes sequenced, which means we're constantly adding new information, and thus changes have to be made in response to that new information. It's definitely a live science. It's always evolving because, you know, evolution goes forward. So, when we're doing this, you kind of have to consider it making a puzzle with just the edge pieces. Your reference picture is out of focus, and the dog ate most of your middle pieces because those are the equivalent of your fossil record, which, as you probably know, is incomplete, and while it's very helpful, because it's incomplete means that we're filling in a lot of gaps, or trying to the best of our ability. This is not helped, particularly with birds, in that the definition of species is a little fuzzy. So we've got this lovely depiction of all of our birds, fairly straightforward. We've got things like our ostriches as our most basal bird, and then you get all the way up into the passerines, those songbirds, which are very highly evolved. But that doesn't... Birds get tricky. And as a birder, you can kind of take species as something, a group of individuals that shares appearance, physiology. They're going to be sharing habits, things like voice, DNA, obviously, because that's how you get all of those things. And they tend to breed with each other by preference. And I say tend to because hybrids happen, and if you've ever tried to figure out gulls, or even ducks, you know that hybrids can be super confusing. And for that reason, there's a lot of debate, quite frequently, on the taxonomic tree of birds. In fact, the American Ornithological Union every year has a conference to debate species, whether species should be split or not, if a group of species should be shoved in their own genus, away from the rest of them because they're distinct enough to merit that. So in 2019, we saw in North America, for our North American birds, we saw an entirely new genus formed for some of our warblers. The white-winged scoter got split into 3 species. So in North America, we got to keep the white-winged scoter. But in Europe, it is the velvet scoter, and the Asian white-winged scoters got a name that I'm kind of afraid to try and pronounce. So you can look that one up because it's got lots of consonants there. I'm not going to try it, but this means your lists are going to be changing, and it's why field guides put out new editions. So this is the 6th edition for the Nat Geo book. I should probably update to the 7th edition, but I think at this point I'm just going to wait until the 8th comes out. And the reason for that is names change, orders. The order of the birds can flip around. Sometimes species get moved into different families based on this new information. So it is something worth paying attention to, and if you find an old field guide and you're just like, well, it's 20 years old, but the birds are the birds. And that's why if you open it up, you're going to find not the ducks at the front, but the loons. When you're just identifying the birds, it doesn't really matter, but if you want to pay more attention to how the birds are actually existing as organisms, it is useful to know. So, why do you care? Taxonomy is based on similarities. If you're familiar with the shared traits of a family of birds or a genus of birds, that's going to help you narrow down what the species is. If you can recognize, well, that bird, I don't know exactly what that species is, but it's got characteristics that tell me it's a warbler. Suddenly, you're not paying attention to your entire book or even the back half of your book. You're just paying attention to a couple of pages in it. And that means you can get your identification a lot faster and a lot more accurately. You're not going to take a look at a bird and be like, oh, that's a sparrow probably, and it's in fact a finch. So it saves you time. The scientific names, which tell you the species and the genus, tend to be a little bit more descriptive. Common names can be misleading. Things like the California scrub jay, it's definitely found in California, but it's also in Washington and Oregon and Baja. So you can't just be like, oh, that's a Baja scrub jay. That's not a thing. The odds are pretty low that you're going to actually find a Connecticut warbler in Connecticut, but you're pretty likely to find one in the summertime in Michigan or Wisconsin or Ontario. It only flies through Connecticut, so I'm not sure how it won that name. The bobwhite says its name, but screech owls don't screech. So while we can hope that a common name is descriptive and will help us identify a bird, that's not something you should actually be relying on. So, our bird of the day actually does have a descriptive name. This little dude is a dapper little flycatcher that if you're in California or on the West Coast, you'll spot them by bodies of water, in your neighborhoods, and if you're birding in California, it's not really birding unless you've spotted these guys. So, this is our black Phoebe. Now, they've got a pretty distinctive call. It sounds a little bit like they're saying their name, that Phoebe, Phoeboo, over and over again, but, I mean, this bird's a little class act. Take a look at him. So, they're pretty distinctive, that bright white underbelly and that black body. These birds are flycatchers, so they are going to be feeding on things like wasps, bees, flies. They'll actually occasionally snag small minnows to bring back to the nest if they're able to, but it is a sparrow-sized bird, so they're going to have to be pretty small fish. These have a really wonderful, distinctive hunting style. It's called sallying. And what they'll do is they'll find a perch, like this fence post this guy is on, and then they swoop off of it. So, what they're doing is they're going to swoop off, grab whatever caught their eye, and then land again in order to eat it. So, here's one with a wasp. We really like having them in the area because it does mean it's taking care of those flying insects. Natural pest control is always the best way to go. They're fairly monogamous by songbird standards. Pairs can stick together for around 5 years or so, and the oldest bird on record was actually 8 years old. So that's the majority of the lifetime for most of these birds. They've got a really fantastic courting behavior, in that the males will actually show the females all of its potential nesting sites within its territory. They're kind of doing a real estate tour before they decide to actually build the nest. And the female is going to be responsible for building that nest. They tend to like to nest on cliff sides, under the eaves of buildings. They'll build a mud cup nest, so it's pretty messy. They're fairly easy to find because of that. They'll lay their eggs, and then within about 3 weeks or so after the eggs have hatched, their babies are ready to fly off. So these are a really fun bird to watch. They're incredibly active. You're going to be finding them in your neighborhood parks if you've got any ponds or creeks nearby. Schoolyards are another common place to find these guys. So they're a good one to watch out for. They're distinct, they're quite vocal, and they're just a lot of fun to pay attention to because they're so active. They're always hunting. They're predators, even if what they're preying on is very small. So with that, I'm going to leave y'all to the rest of your week. Have a very nice day, and get outside and enjoy the nice weather, yeah?